Okay, we are back with Ron Paulk, and this time we'll be discussing the latest generation of his Paulk Workbench, a portable yet full-sized work surface for builders on the go. Here's a time lapse of Ron assembling the bench from start to finish. Now, while Ron initially designed this purely for himself, the Paulk Workbench has become something of a DIY sensation, which we'll get to in just a bit. But first, we're going to talk to Ron about the design. Ron, what generation of the Workbench are we looking at?
This one is called the Paulk Workbench II. It's the second generation of the bench that I've made available to other carpenters. But prior to the original Workbench, I had two iterations in developing the first bench.
And prior to designing your own bench, what were you using as a work surface?
Prior to that, I had used many temporary benches over the years, from the basic plastic sawhorses that you purchase at the lumber store with a sheet of 3/4 inch plywood. And also, quite a few years I used a 3-foot by 6/8 door blank, just a hollow core door. For years and years, that was my primary indoor or finished workbench.
So what inspired you to design your own?
The use of those other benches. Additionally, I purchased a few commercially available benches, and what I was finding is that benches were too heavy, too hard to set up, but primarily they were too small. To get a bench for what I do in finished carpentry, where I'm building cabinets, assembling cabinets, building fireplace mantles and large bookcases, I just needed a little more space. So I decided that the 4x8 was the size I needed. That was the minimum size that would work for me. And to do that, I had to use a full sheet of plywood. The problem with plywood is it doesn't stay completely flat, and then you end up trying to put some strong backs or something on it to keep it stiff, and then it gets heavy and hard to move around. So, you know, the idea then to split it into two pieces that when put together functioned as one, sort of started with that concept. And then the other problem with workbenches is that they become collectors of everything on the job. So you need a place to set a tool, that's where you set it. You take off your nail bags, that's where you set it. You got a project you're working on, you set it on the bench. And then when you go to work on the bench, you have to unload the bench just to use it. So then the concept of having storage space, usable space to set your tools down and your glue down and your screw bins and all those things beneath the bench while you're working, so they're right there for you to grab, but they're not taking up space on your top.
And tell us about the perforations on the work surface.
Yeah, the perforations are not original. They're bench dog holes. You'll find them on lots and lots of benches. I set them up so they're 4-inch on center, and they cover the entire workbench surface. They allow me to clamp anywhere on the bench that's necessary, and I happen to use the Festool C-clamps, but they drop right in the holes, and I can clamp down for gluing or if I'm going to screw something together. And I can also attach any number of fixtures that I build out of wood on the job, just to hold things down, or templates, guides, things like that. So that was the purpose of the holes, was just to be a clamping surface.
And obviously, to hold things like mantles and cabinets, the bench needs to be quite sturdy. So what made you opt for using 1/2-inch plywood rather than the 3/4 inch?
I decided that the design that I was working with, more of a truss, a box beam, I was going to get the strength from the engineering and not from the mass. And that was intentional. I knew that building this box basically so that I could have an inside usable space, I would not need the mass, that the 1/2-inch would be as rigid as the 3/4, and that gives me the added benefit of weight.
Can you tell us about the design thinking behind mounting the table saw to the end of the workbench?
Instead of carrying a stand to hold it up and then working out an outfeed, I decided that with this large bench already set up that it'd make a perfect outfeed. And then if I put it on the manufacturer's stand right in front of the bench and use as an outfeed, I have to be concerned about getting exactly the same height. And also, if I'm working on a surface that's not level, or at least running at the same angle, then you end up with the table saw surface not being plane or flush with, in plane with the bench or with the outfeed. So I realized that I needed to come up with some way to mount the table saw on the bench so that the bench doubles as the outfeed and as the support. And so I just played around with a lot of different ideas and came up with just a couple of inexpensive pipes mounted inside of the workbench that just pull out, and a little mounting system out of the same 1/2-inch plywood attached to the saw so that I could just set the saw on the pipes without having to attach it. So it becomes an easy on, easy off, and very stable way to hold my table saw. And the setup time is very minimized.
Now, the earlier versions of the workbench did not contain a router table, but this one does. What made you decide to add it?
Just like the table saw, it was one of those things where I'd have to carry another tool, another bench. And when I'm doing routing on a router table, I'm not doing other things. I'm not running the table saw or the miter saw. So I decided that since I already have the surface, I'd go ahead and just integrate in a router table into it. And the router table that I integrated in is pretty common. It's very much like any router table you can purchase on the market, only it's just integrated into this bench.
And speaking of things that are on the market, in the next episode we'll talk to Ron about how he discovered that he had inadvertently created a product design hit. I'm Rain No, signing off for Ron Paulk and Core 77 TV.